There was a room buried deep inside a research facility near Moscow in 1967 where engineers were solving a problem no one else had even admitted existed yet. They weren't building weapons to win wars, they were designing systems to survive them. What they created that winter would redefine what military technology could become. And decades later, we're still catching up to ideas they sketched on paper under fluorescent lights that barely worked. This isn't about propaganda or Cold War mythology. It's about the moment innovation stopped being about power and started being about survival. Most people think of Soviet military tech as bulky, outdated, crude machinery held together by necessity and grit. That image isn't entirely wrong, but it misses something crucial. The Soviets didn't have the luxury of unlimited budgets or Silicon Valley optimism. They had constraints, serious ones, and those constraints forced them to think differently. When you can't outspend your enemy, you have to outsmart them. And in that pressure, in that scarcity, some of the most elegant solutions in modern warfare were born. Not despite the limitations, but because of them. Take the Kalashnikov rifle. Everyone knows the AK-47, but most people don't understand why it became the most produced firearm in human history. It wasn't just reliable, it was designed to be maintained by soldiers with no formal training. In mud, sand, snow, or jungle heat. Mikhail Kalashnikov didn't create a perfect rifle. He created one that worked when everything else failed. That philosophy, radical simplicity, married to brutal effectiveness, became the Soviet signature. It wasn't about being the best on paper. It was about being the best when the paper caught fire. Then there's the T-34 tank, a machine that changed the course of World War II, not because it was invincible, but because it was producible. German panzers were engineering marvels, but they took too long to build and broke down too often. The T-34 was sloped, fast, easy to manufacture, and could be repaired in the field with a hammer and a wrench. Soviet engineers understood something their counterparts didn't. War isn't won by the most advanced technology, it's won by the technology that can be deployed, maintained, and replaced faster than the enemy can destroy it. That's not just smart, that's visionary. Soviet innovation wasn't limited to land and steel. Their approach to space technology rewrote the rules entirely. While the Americans were obsessing over precision and miniaturization, Soviet engineers were building rockets that could lift staggering payloads with engines that seemed almost primitive by comparison. The R-7 rocket family, which launched Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin into orbit, used a cluster of engines that were individually less powerful but collectively unstoppable. It was redundant, over-engineered in some ways, and utterly reliable. When one engine failed, the others compensated. That mindset, built for failure, designed for resilience, became a cornerstone of Soviet aerospace engineering. And then there's something most people have never heard of: reactive armor. In the 1980s, Western tanks were struggling with shape-charged warheads that could punch through steel like tissue paper. Soviet engineers developed explosive reactive armor, or ERA, layer of explosives sandwiched between metal plates that would detonate outward when hit, neutralizing incoming projectiles. It sounds insane. It was insane, but it worked. And it worked so well that today, nearly every modern tank in the world uses some variation of that concept. The Soviets didn't wait for a perfect solution. They tested, adapted, and deployed what worked, even if it looked unconventional. But here's where it gets deeper. Soviet innovation wasn't just about hardware, it was about doctrine. They understood that technology is only as good as the system it operates within, so they built integrated air defense networks that could communicate across vast distances, share targeting data, and coordinate responses in real time. The S-75 DVNA system, which shot down Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane in 1960, wasn't just a missile. It was part of a networked defense strategy that anticipated modern battlefield integration by decades. They weren't just building weapons, they were building ecosystems of survival. What's fascinating is how much of this came from necessity rather than ambition. The Soviet Union was resource-constrained, technologically isolated, and constantly playing catch-up. But instead of copying Western designs, they reimagined the problems themselves. They asked different questions. Not how do we make this faster, but how do we make this work in Siberia in February? Not how do we make this lighter, but how do we make this last 30 years with minimal maintenance? That shift in perspective created technologies that were often less glamorous but far more resilient. And resilience was the key. Soviet military tech was designed for the worst-case scenario: total war, scorched earth, supply lines cut, infrastructure destroyed. Every system had to function independently, be repairable in the field, and require minimal specialized training. It's why their aircraft could take off from dirt runways, why their vehicles ran on low-grade fuel, why their radios worked without satellite uplinks. They didn't assume comfort or stability. They assumed chaos, and they engineered accordingly. There's a lesson in that one that goes beyond military hardware. When you design for extremes, for failure, for the unforgiving edge of possibility, you create something that doesn't just work in ideal conditions. You create something that endures. Soviet engineers didn't have the luxury of prototyping endlessly or iterating in controlled environments. They had to get it right the first time, or people died. That kind of pressure doesn't always produce brilliance. But when it does, the results are undeniable. Now, I'm not romanticizing the Soviet Union. The political system was brutal. The human cost was staggering. And many innovations came at the expense of individual freedom and safety. But separating the ethics of a regime from the ingenuity of its engineers is important. These were people solving impossible problems with limited resources, often under threat, and what they created still shapes modern defense strategy. Ignoring that because of ideology would be intellectually dishonest. So are Soviet innovations in military tech groundbreaking? The answer isn't just yes, it's that they fundamentally changed how we think about engineering itself. They proved that constraints can drive creativity, that simplicity can be radical, and that the best solution isn't always the most advanced one. It's the one that works when everything else has failed. That's not just groundbreaking. That's foundational. What surprised me the most wasn't just how a comprehensive historical documentary box set on Cold War engineering improved my experience with understanding military innovation, but how everything started to feel different once I switched to the right one. I didn't expect such a clear change, and honestly, I tested more than a few before finding what actually worked. This isn't a promo or sponsorship, just sharing real results that made a noticeable difference for me. I'll leave the link below, in case you want to dig into it yourself and see what I mean. The legacy of Soviet military technology isn't just in museums or history books. It's in every modern defense system that prioritizes resilience over refinement. In every piece of equipment designed to function without external support. In every strategy that assumes the worst and engineers for survival. The Cold War ended, but the principles born in those frozen research labs didn't. They evolved, spread, and became the invisible foundation of how we build for conflict today. And maybe that's the most groundbreaking thing of all, not the technology itself, but the way of thinking that created it. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.